The sound that satisfies historians is rarely a gavel striking wood or a stock ticker printing its final number. Sometimes it is something far more personal. It is November 14th, 1907. Inside a bedroom on East 38th Street in Manhattan, Charles Barney raises a pistol to his chest and pulls the trigger. When his wife and servants burst through the mahogany doors, they do not find a man who has been bankrupted. They find a man with $2.5 million in assets still sitting in various accounts across the city. He is not broke. He has not been charged with a crime. He has not lost his home, his art collection, or his membership at any of the clubs that define status in Gilded Age New York. So why is there a bullet in his chest? 3 weeks earlier, Charles Barney had been the president of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, the third largest financial institution of its kind in New York City. He had dined with Vanderbilts, married into the Whitney fortune, and commanded deposits of more than $60 million. Then, in the span of 72 hours, it all vanished. Not because his bank was insolvent, not because he had committed fraud, but because the most powerful man in American finance, J.P. Morgan, looked at the numbers, looked at the panic spreading through the streets, and decided that Charles Barney was not worth saving. What you are about to hear is the story of how one regulatory loophole created an empire built on thin reserves, how a failed scheme to corner the copper market triggered the worst financial panic since the Civil War, and how the collapse of a single institution led directly to the creation of the Federal Reserve System. If you want to understand how financial panics actually work, not the sanitized textbook version, but the blood and betrayal version, make sure to like and subscribe. We are just getting started. To understand why the Knickerbocker Trust collapsed, you have to understand the quiet war that had been simmering in American finance for 2 decades. It was a war between 2 tribes of bankers, and it was fought not with guns but with balance sheets. On one side stood the national banks. These were the establishment institutions, the fortresses of old money regulated by the federal government under the National Banking Acts passed during the Civil War. The law required them to keep 25% of all deposits in cash reserves. For every dollar a depositor handed over, the bank could only lend out 75 cents. The remaining quarter had to sit in the vault, untouched, waiting for a rainy day. This was the brake pedal built into the system. It limited profits, but it also meant that if 100 nervous depositors showed up on a Tuesday afternoon demanding their money, the bank could pay them and keep operating. The reserves were a shock absorber, but there was a second tribe emerging in the financial ecosystem, and they operated under very different rules. They were called trust companies. Originally, trust companies were never meant to compete with banks at all. They were created in the mid-1800s for the quiet, respectable business of managing estates, holding assets for widows and orphans, and serving as trustees for wealthy families who needed someone to oversee their investments. Because they were supposed to be passive custodians rather than active lenders, state regulators saw no reason to impose heavy reserve requirements. A trust company in New York might be required to hold only 5% of deposits in cash. Some held even less. For decades, this distinction did not matter much. Trust companies stayed in their lane, managing inheritances and collecting modest fees. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, ambitious men began to notice that the trust company charter contained a remarkable opportunity hiding in plain sight. Think about the arithmetic for a moment. A national bank takes in $1 million and can lend out $750,000. A trust company takes in $1 million and can lend out $950,000. The trust company can put almost every dollar to work, earning interest on a much larger pile of loans. It can afford to pay depositors higher interest rates to attract their money because it is generating more revenue per dollar. Now, in theory, this should have been fine. The trust companies were handling stable, long-term money from wealthy clients who were unlikely to panic. They did not need the same safety margins as commercial banks that dealt with volatile business accounts. But here is where the theory collided with reality. By 1900, ambitious trust company executives had figured out that there was nothing stopping them from accepting commercial deposits, just like a regular bank. There was nothing preventing them from making short-term loans to stock speculators. There was nothing in the law that said they had to remain quiet custodians. So they stopped being quiet. The trust company sector in New York exploded. Assets that had grown modestly for decades suddenly expanded by 244% in the 10 years before 1907. During the same period, national bank assets grew by only 97%. The trust companies were not just keeping pace with the establishment, they were leaving it in the dust. This growth came from poaching. Trust companies offered depositors interest rates that national banks simply could not match. They were not being more efficient or smarter. They were just operating with less safety margin. Every dollar that was not sitting idle in a reserve vault was a dollar that could be lent out at interest. The mathematics made them look brilliant. The national bankers watched this transformation with a mixture of contempt and alarm. To men like J.P. Morgan and his allies at the National Bank of Commerce and First National Bank, the trust companies were not innovators. They were reckless gamblers who had found a way to cheat the system. They enjoyed the profits of leverage during good times, but when bad times came, they would have no cushion to absorb the blow. The trust company men saw it differently. They saw the old guard as dinosaurs, clinging to outdated rules while the world changed around them. They saw the 25% reserve as a tax on innovation. This was 1907, remember? Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House, busting trusts and sending the Great White Fleet around the world to demonstrate American power. Henry Ford was putting the final touches on the Model T, which would revolutionize transportation the following year. Oklahoma had just been admitted as the 46th state. The country was expanding, industrializing, confident that the old rules no longer applied. The trust companies were part of that. Confidence. They were financing the subways being dug under Manhattan, the skyscrapers rising on the skyline, the new economy that was going to make everyone rich. In 1890, trust company assets in New York totaled around $200 million. By 1907, they had exploded to over $1 billion. National banks, by comparison, grew by only 97% during the same period. The national bankers complained bitterly about unfair competition. They argued that they were being forced to compete against institutions that had effectively cheated the system. It was like racing against a car that had removed its seatbelts and airbags to reduce weight. But the complaints fell on deaf ears. The trust companies were popular. They were paying higher interest to depositors. They were financing exciting new ventures. They were the future. Or so everyone believed. The reckoning would begin with a company founded 23 years earlier by one of Morgan's own classmates. The Knickerbocker Trust Company was born in 1884, the creation of a man named Frederick Eldridge. Eldridge was not a flamboyant figure. He was a careful, well-connected banker who understood that in Gilded Age New York, who you knew mattered as much as what you knew. His most valuable credential was his friendship with a former classmate from his school days, a young man who would grow up to become the most powerful financier in America, John Pierpont Morgan. The two had attended school together and remained friendly as their careers diverged. Eldridge moved into banking, while Morgan built an empire that would eventually control railroads, steel mills, and the flow of capital across the Atlantic. When Eldridge chartered the Knickerbocker Trust Company, he was tapping into a network of relationships that stretched to the very top of the financial establishment. Remember that connection. It will become bitterly ironic. Eldridge had positioned the Knickerbocker perfectly for the world of 1884. Trust companies were respectable but modest operations. They did not compete with the great national banks for commercial business. They simply managed money for people who had already made it. But Eldridge would not live to see what his creation became. He died in 1889, just 5 years after founding the company, leaving behind an institution with solid foundations and unrealized potential. The men who followed him would transform that modest beginning into something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. Eldridge served as president until his death in 1889, when the position passed to John Townsend. Townsend ran the company competently for 5 years before leaving to become president of the Bowery Savings Bank, a more prestigious post. After Townsend's departure, the board unanimously chose Robert McClay as the new president. McClay was a steady hand, the kind of banker who believed in caution and conservatism. He maintained the Knickerbocker's reputation as a respectable institution serving respectable clients. Under his leadership, the company grew slowly but reliably. But McClay also recognized that the trust company industry was changing, and that Knickerbocker needed someone with energy and ambition to help it grow. He found the man in a young banker who had joined the company the same year it was founded. His name was Charles Tracy Barney. Barney had joined Knickerbocker in 1884 as a junior employee with big ambitions. He was young, charming, and extraordinarily well-connected. Born in Cleveland in 1851, he was the son of Ashbel H. Barney, a successful businessman who had served as president of Wells Fargo and Company during its expansion across the American West. The elder Barney was a director of the company from 1859 to 1883 and served as its president from 1869 to 1870. Young, Charles grew up surrounded by money and the men who moved it. After graduating from Williams College in 1870, where he was a member of the Kappa Alpha Society, he moved to New York to make his fortune in banking. His father's reputation opened some doors, but Charles understood that he needed his own connections to truly succeed. His first major strategic move was romantic. In 1876, he married Lily Whitney, the sister of William Collins Whitney. If that name does not immediately register, it should. William Whitney was one of the most powerful men in America. He served as Secretary of the Navy under President Grover Cleveland, modernizing the fleet and establishing the United States as a serious naval power. He built a fortune in street railways and urban transit, controlling the systems that moved millions of New Yorkers to work each day. He was a kingmaker in democratic politics and moved through the highest circles of society with the ease of a man who had been born to rule. By marrying into the Whitney family, Charles Barney gained access to a world that most bankers could only dream about. He dined with the Vanderbilts. He summered at Newport. He sat on the boards of railroad companies and real estate syndicates. When William Whitney needed a reliable banker for his various investments, he turned to his brother-in-law. When wealthy friends of the Whitney circle needed someone to manage their money, Charles Barney's name came up. The Whitney connection opened every door in New York, and Barney walked through all of them. At Knickerbocker, Barney rose steadily through the ranks. Maclay recognized his talents and made him vice president. The two men worked well together, Maclay providing the caution and Barney providing the connections. Then, in 1897, when Maclay retired, the board elected Barney to the presidency. This is where the story accelerates. Barney was 46 years old when he took over. He had spent 2 decades learning the business, building relationships, and watching the trust company sector transform from a sleepy backwater into the most dynamic part of American finance. Now, he had the chance to put his ideas into practice. His vision was simple. The Knickerbocker would not remain a dignified custodian of old money. It would become an engine of new money, financing the industries that were reshaping America. Under Barney's leadership, the company would lend aggressively, grow rapidly, and prove that the new model of banking could outcompete the conservative establishment. The results were spectacular. When Barney took over in 1897, the Knickerbocker held approximately $11 million in deposits. Within 5 years, that number had more than tripled. Within a decade, it had exploded to more than 60 million. How did he do it? The mechanics were straightforward. Because Knickerbocker operated under trust company rules with minimal reserve requirements, it could afford to pay depositors higher interest rates than the national banks. Money flowed in from New York's rising middle class, the shopkeepers and professionals and small businessmen who wanted better returns on their savings. The national banks offered safety but paid meager interest. Barney offered something better. He used that money aggressively. While the old guard was still obsessing over railroads and government bonds, Barney was financing the future. He invested heavily in the construction of the New York City subway system, the great engineering project that would transform how the city moved. He backed real estate developments that were reshaping the Manhattan skyline. He lent money to entrepreneurs and speculators who were building the infrastructure of a new century. The risks were real, but so were the rewards. Knickerbocker's stock price soared to over $1,000 per share. Barney was hailed as a visionary, the banker who understood that the old rules no longer applied. And in 1902, he began construction on a headquarters building that would announce to the world that the Knickerbocker had arrived at the very summit of American finance. The architect Charles Barney chose for his new headquarters was Stanford White of McKim, Mead, and White, the most prestigious architectural firm in America. White was a celebrity in his own right. a flamboyant genius who had designed Madison Square Garden, the Washington Square Arch, and dozens of the mansions and monuments that defined Gilded Age excess. His firm had created the Boston Public Library, the Rhode Island State Capitol, and countless churches, clubs, and private residences for the wealthiest families in America. White was also, as it happened, a man whose personal life was about to explode into scandal. In June of 1906, just as the Knickerbocker Building was completing its second full year of operation, Stanford White was shot and killed at a rooftop theater in Madison Square Garden. The murderer was Harry Thaw, the mentally unstable heir to a Pittsburgh railroad fortune. Thaw believed White had seduced his wife, the actress Evelyn Nesbit, when she was a young showgirl. The shooting happened in front of hundreds of witnesses, and the subsequent trial became the media sensation of the decade. But in 1902, when Barney commissioned him, White was still at the height of his powers. The building he designed for Knickerbocker was a statement of imperial ambition. Located at the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street, the Knickerbocker headquarters rose like a Roman temple transplanted to Manhattan. The message was clear. This was not some fly-by-night operation. This was permanence. This was stability. This was a place where your money would be safe. The building opened in 1904, and it immediately became one of the landmarks of the city. Tourists gawked at the columns. Depositors felt a thrill of pride walking through the bronze doors. Branch offices followed in Harlem and the Bronx. At 60 Broadway, another Knickerbocker outpost served the downtown financial crowd. Barney had built an empire. By early 1907, the Knickerbocker Trust Company was the third largest trust company in New York City, trailing only the Farmers Loan and Trust and the Central Trust Company. Charles Barney sat at the center of a web of directorships and investments that made him one of the most influential men in American finance. He served on the board of the New York Loan and Improvement Company. He was a trustee of the Bank for Savings. He held directorships in insurance companies, mortgage companies, real estate syndicates, and steamship lines. He was a shareholder in sugar plantations in Cuba and railroads across the continent. The year 1907 had started with warning signs that only became obvious in retrospect. In January, the stock market was already sliding from its peak the previous year. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had hit highs in early 1906, was bleeding value month after month. The problem started far from Wall Street. In April, a financial panic struck. Egypt, rattling banks in Cairo and Alexandria. In May and June, similar disturbances rippled through Japan, where banks failed and depositors panicked. In Germany, the stock market wobbled. In Chile, financial institutions came under pressure. These were not isolated events. They were symptoms of a global liquidity shortage. Gold, the foundation of the international monetary system, was flowing in unpredictable directions. The Bank of England raised interest rates to protect its reserves. Other central banks followed suit. Credit was tightening everywhere. In America, specific shocks added to the general unease. In April of 1906, a catastrophic earthquake had devastated San Francisco, killing thousands and causing hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. British insurance companies had paid out massive claims, draining gold from London. The aftershocks of that disaster were still rippling through the financial system more than a year later. In July of 1907, the copper market began to weaken. Prices that speculators had driven to record highs started falling. This might seem like an obscure development, but copper was one of the most traded commodities in America. Fortunes were built on copper. Banks held copper company stocks as collateral. When copper fell, balance sheets across the country shrank. In August, Standard Oil was hit with a $29 million antitrust fine, the largest in American history. The Rockefeller empire seemed suddenly vulnerable. If the government could break Standard Oil, what company was safe? If you were paying attention, you could feel the ground shifting. The easy money that had fueled the boom was getting tighter. Interest rates were creeping up. The smart money was getting nervous, but none of this seemed urgent to most observers. The economy had absorbed shocks before. The fundamental story of American growth had not changed. Business was still expanding. Factories were still running. The underlying optimism of the age remained intact. The fundamental story almost never changes. It is always the details that kill you. Charles Barney did not see disaster coming. He saw opportunity. He saw a chance to grow the Knickerbocker even faster as competitors stumbled. He saw the possibility of becoming not merely one of the leading bankers in New York, but the leading banker. And in pursuit of that ambition, he had allowed himself to be drawn into the orbit of men who would prove to be his undoing. Enter Augustus Heinze. To understand him, you have to understand the copper wars of Montana. Heinze was born in Brooklyn in 1869, the son of a wealthy German immigrant who had made good in America. He had trained as a mining engineer. He was brilliant, multilingual, and blessed with the kind of charisma that made men follow him into battle. After graduating, Heinze could have taken a comfortable position with an established mining company. Instead, he went west to Butte, Montana, where copper was being pulled from the earth in quantities that were making some men fabulously rich. The problem was that the richest deposits were already controlled by the Amalgamated Copper Company, a trust backed by Standard Oil money and the Rockefeller interests. Amalgamated had consolidated the major mines of Butte into a single corporate entity with overwhelming resources. Any newcomer trying to compete faced one of the most powerful corporations in America. Heinze competed anyway. He arrived in Butte in 1889 with little more than his engineering degree and a modest inheritance. Within a few years, he had purchased several small mining claims and begun extracting copper. His operations were tiny compared to Amalgamated, but Heinze had discovered something that would make him a legend. He had found a loophole. Montana's mining laws included an obscure provision called the Apex Law. Under this rule, whoever owned the surface rights to a mining claim could follow a vein of ores wherever it led underground, even if it crossed beneath a neighbor's property. The theory was that a vein originated where it surfaced, and the surface owner had rights to the entire vein regardless of property boundaries. Heinze realized that if he could claim his small surface operations sat atop the apex of rich veins, he could legally mine ore that lay beneath Amalgamated's holdings. He hired geologists to produce surveys supporting his interpretation. He brought lawsuits, claiming that veins originating on his properties extended beneath the Amalgamated mines. The legal battles were epic. Heinze cultivated relationships with local judges, who issued favorable rulings that tied Amalgamated up in court for years. While the lawyers argued, Heinze kept mining the disputed ore. He became a hero to the workers of Butte, who saw him as a scrappy underdog fighting the Rockefeller monopoly. He gave speeches denouncing the Standard Oil crowd as carpetbaggers and thieves. This was not just business for Heinze, it was war. For nearly a decade, he fought Amalgamated to a standstill. The corporation had more money, more lawyers, more political connections. But Heinze had tenacity, local support, and an absolute refusal to quit. Eventually, Amalgamated decided that buying him out was cheaper than continuing the fight. In 1906, they paid him more than $10 million just to go away. Heinze took the money and headed for New York, convinced that he could conquer Wall Street the same way he had conquered Butte. He was 37 years old, flush with cash, and utterly certain of his own genius. He had beaten the Rockefellers once. He believed he could beat anyone. But Heinze made a decision that would prove fateful. He kept one company for himself, refusing to include it in the sale to Amalgamated. The company was called United Copper, and it held his remaining mining interests. United Copper was his flag, his symbol of independence, and he believed his old enemies were still coming for it. His partner in the New York adventure was Charles Morse, a man whose nickname tells you everything you need to know about his character. They called him the Ice King. Morse was born in Bath, Maine, in 1856. His family operated tugboats and ice houses on the Kennebec River, shipping ice cut from frozen Maine waters to the sweltering cities of the East Coast. The ice trade was a major industry in the era before mechanical refrigeration, and young Charles showed an early talent for consolidation. His technique was simple. He would buy up small ice operations along the river, eliminating competition and gaining control over supply. By the time he graduated, he had made himself a small fortune. Over the following decades, Morse applied this strategy on a larger scale. He bought ice companies throughout Maine and then expanded south. In 1897, he created the Consolidated Ice Company. 2 years later, he merged it with several rivals to form the American Ice Company, capitalized at $60 million. American Ice gave Morse control over virtually all the ice sold in New York City. In the summer of 1900, he decided to test his monopoly power. He raised prices dramatically, squeezing the city's poorest residents who depended on ice to keep food from spoiling and to provide relief from the brutal heat. The public outcry was enormous. Newspapers investigated and discovered that Morse had bribed Tammany Hall politicians to secure exclusive rights to harvest ice from city waters. Mayor Robert Van Wyck was exposed as a secret shareholder. The scandal ended Morse's ice monopoly and briefly threatened to end his career. But Morse was resilient. He pivoted to shipping, assembling a fleet of steamship lines that controlled coastal freight traffic from Maine to Texas. And he pivoted to banking, using a technique that was ingeniously simple and dangerously fragile. Morse's banking scheme worked like this. He would buy a controlling stake in one bank using his personal funds. Then he would borrow money from that bank to buy shares in a second bank. The second bank's deposits would be pledged as collateral to acquire a third. Each acquisition was leveraged on top of the last, a pyramid of paper that generated the illusion of vast wealth while creating genuine control. By the summer of 1907, Morse sat on the boards of at least 6 national banks, 10 state banks, 5 trust companies, and 4 insurance firms. His interlocking directorships created a shadow empire that rivaled the Morgan interests in complexity. But unlike Morgan's empire, which was built on decades of relationship building and genuine financial strength, Morse's was a house of cards. Each institution depended on the others. If one fell, it could pull down the rest. Heinze and Morse found each other in New York and recognized kindred spirits. Both men were outsiders who had clawed their way to fortune through aggression and cunning. Both despised the conservative establishment led by J.P. Morgan, which viewed them as dangerous interlopers who threatened the stability of the system. And both believed that the rules governing old money banking were for suckers who lacked imagination. The two men began working together in earnest. Heinze brought his United Copper holdings and his Montana money. Morse brought his network of banks and his genius for leveraged acquisitions. They shared directors and coordinated strategies. Their networks overlapped at institution after institution, creating a web of mutual dependencies that amplified both their power and their vulnerability. To the establishment, they were a two-headed monster. Morgan and his allies watched the expansion of the Heinze-Morse network with growing alarm. These were not responsible bankers building for the long term. These were speculators playing games with depositor money, accumulating power without regard for the risks they were creating. The old guard began to whisper about a reckoning. Sooner or later, the Heinze-Morse house of cards would collapse. The only question was how much damage it would cause when it fell. Charles Barney moved in the same social circles as these men. He knew Heinze and Morse through the endless rounds of dinners and club meetings that constituted networking in Gilded Age New York. The New York financial community was remarkably small. Everyone knew everyone. Connections were unavoidable. The exact nature of Barney's relationship with the gamblers remains somewhat murky even today. Some sources suggest that he provided financing for their various schemes, that Knickerbocker money flowed into Heinze-connected ventures. Others indicate that his involvement was more casual, a matter of social connection rather than business partnership. He served on some of the same boards. He attended some of the same gatherings. When Heinze threw a party, Barney might be on the guest list. In the world of Gilded Age finance, such overlaps were normal. Everyone sat on multiple boards. Everyone knew everyone. The question was not whether you were connected to other bankers, but how closely. What is clear is that when the establishment looked at Barney, they saw a man who kept dangerous company. The Knickerbocker was associated with the Heinze-Morse crowd, whether Barney liked it or not. His social connections had created a perception of partnership, and in a crisis, perception would matter more than reality. The scheme that destroyed the American economy in 1907 was dreamed up not by Augustus Heinze, but by his brother, Otto. Otto Heinze ran a brokerage firm with his brother Arthur on Broad Street, just around the corner from the New York Stock Exchange. He was not the charismatic fighter that Augustus was. He was a numbers man, a calculator, someone who saw the world in terms of shares outstanding and positions held. In October of 1907, Otto became convinced that he had spotted an opportunity in United Copper, the company Augustus had retained after selling his Montana holdings. Otto believed that enemies of the Heinze family, connected to Standard Oil and the Rockefeller interests, were quietly shorting United Copper stock. Shorting means borrowing shares and selling them at the current price, betting that the stock will fall. If the price drops, the short seller buys replacement shares cheaper and pockets the difference. If the price rises, the short seller loses money. Short selling is a bet on failure. And Otto was convinced that the Rockefeller crowd was betting on his brother's failure. He proposed a trap, a corner. Here is how a corner works. If you can secretly buy up most of the available shares of a stock, you can catch short sellers in a vice. When they need to return the shares they borrowed, they discover that you control the supply. You are the only seller in town. You can name your price. They pay whatever you demand, or they default on their obligations and face ruin. When it works, a corner is one of the most profitable maneuvers in finance. Fortunes have been made in a matter of days by men who successfully trapped short sellers. Otto believed the Heinze family already controlled the majority of United Copper shares. He calculated that only a small number remained in circulation, the so-called floating supply. If he could vacuum up those remaining shares through aggressive buying, the short sellers would be trapped. The brothers approached Charles Barney to request financing for the scheme. What happened in that meeting is still debated by historians. Some accounts suggest that Barney provided loans to support the corner. Others, including contemporary reports, indicate that Barney looked at the plan, recognized it as dangerously undercapitalized, and declined to participate. Charles Morse, who was more deeply intertwined with the Heinzes through their interlocking directorships, reportedly warned Otto that the scheme required far more capital than they had assembled. The mathematics of a corner demand overwhelming force. If you control only 90% of the shares, the remaining 10% can sink you. Otto decided to proceed anyway. On Monday, October 14, 1907, he began buying United Copper stock aggressively on the Curb Exchange, the outdoor market where smaller and more speculative stocks traded. The Curb Exchange was not housed in a grand building like the New York Stock Exchange. It operated literally on the curb of Broad Street, with traders shouting orders and using hand signals to communicate in the chaos of open-air trading. Rain or shine, summer or winter, men gathered on that strip of pavement to buy and sell the stocks that were too small or too speculative for the main exchange. United Copper was one of those stocks. It was the remnant of Augustus Heinz's Montana empire, a company with real assets but limited trading volume, perfect for a corner if you controlled enough of the float. Otto bought at $39. He bought at $45. He bought at $50. Every share that hit the market, he grabbed. By midday, traders on the curb were buzzing about the unusual activity. By afternoon, the price had soared to $52. The volume was unlike anything anyone had seen in United Copper before. That night, the Heinze brothers celebrated. They believed they had trapped the short sellers. The numbers seemed to confirm their thesis. There was no way the shorts could find enough shares to cover their positions. Tomorrow, they would spring the trap and destroy their enemies. On Tuesday morning, October 15th, Otto issued the call. He demanded that brokers who had sold shares short deliver the stock immediately. This is the moment in a corner when the trapped short sellers are supposed to panic. They need shares they do not have. The only person with shares is the man who cornered the market. He can name his price. In successful corners, this is where fortunes are made. Short sellers have been forced to pay 10 times, 20 times the natural value of a stock just to escape their obligations. The profits can be astronomical. Otto expected the short sellers to come crawling, forced to buy from the Heinzes at $60, $70, maybe even $100 per share. Instead, shares flooded the market from every direction. Otto had made a catastrophic error in his arithmetic. He had counted the shares held by the Heinze family and their known allies. He had estimated the short interest based on trading patterns, but he had failed to account for the thousands of shares held by ordinary investors who had bought United Copper months or years earlier and simply held on to it. When those investors saw the price spike to $60, they did what any rational person would do. They sold. Why hold a stock at $60 when you bought it at $30? Take the profit. Move on. The market was suddenly flooded with supply. The short sellers did not need to buy from Otto Heinze. They could buy from the retired school teacher in Brooklyn who had inherited 100 shares from her uncle. They could buy from the small speculator in Philadelphia who had been sitting on his position for 2 years. The trapped short sellers found escape routes everywhere, By the end of Tuesday, the artificial demand had evaporated. The price began to slide. On Wednesday, the collapse accelerated. United Copper crashed from $60 to $30 and then kept falling, finally settling around $10 per share. The Wall Street Journal reported that the scenes on the Curb Exchange during the collapse were the wildest anyone could remember. Traders screamed at each other. Fistfights broke out. Men who had been confident of riches on Monday were facing ruin by Wednesday. The corner had failed, but the real catastrophe was just beginning. The first runs hit the banks directly connected to Heinze and Morse. On Thursday, October 17th, depositors lined up at the Mercantile National Bank, where Augustus Heinze served as president. They wanted their money. They did not care about the details of the United Copper corner. They only knew that the man running their bank had just lost a fortune on a failed speculation. If he was that reckless with his own money, what had he done with theirs? The Mercantile scrambled to meet withdrawals, but the lines kept growing. That same day, the New York Clearing House, the association of major banks that settled transactions between institutions, intervened. The Clearing House was the closest thing the American banking system had to a collective defense mechanism. When a member bank faced a run, the Clearing House could provide emergency loans and issue certificates that other banks would accept in lieu of cash. It was not a central bank, but it was the next best thing. The Clearing House examined Mercantile's books and declared it solvent. The assets were there. The problem was liquidity, not insolvency. But they attached a condition to their support. Augustus Heinze had to resign immediately. The gambling era at Mercantile was over. Heinze signed the papers and walked away from the bank he had controlled. Over the following days, the Clearing House forced Morse out of his banking positions as well. Every institution connected to the two men was examined. Those that passed inspection received support. But the price of support was the removal of anyone tainted by association with the failed corner. The establishment was cauterizing the wound, cutting away the infected tissue before the disease could spread. For a few days, it seemed to be working. The national banks connected to Heinze and Morse stabilized. The runs subsided. The Clearing House had contained the crisis within its membership. But infection does not respect boundaries. This was 1907. Remember, there was no Federal Reserve. There was no deposit insurance. There was no government agency whose job was to prevent bank runs. The only thing standing between a solvent bank and destruction was the confidence of its depositors. And confidence, once shaken, is almost impossible to restore. By Friday, October 18th, rumors began circulating that Charles Barney was connected to the Heinze and Morse crowd. Newspapers mentioned his social ties to the gamblers. Reporters noted that Barney had attended the same dinners, sat on some of the same boards, moved in the same circles. The smart money whispered that the Knickerbocker might have exposure to the failed speculation. Was it true? The historical record is genuinely unclear on this point. Some accounts suggest Barney had provided loans to Heinze-connected entities. Others indicate he had specifically refused to participate in the Copper Corner when Otto approached him. The actual financial exposure of the Knickerbocker to Heinze and Morse may have been minimal or even non-existent. But here's the thing about bank runs. They are not about truth. They are about fear. And fear does not wait for accounting audits. The whispers reached the ears of depositors at the Knickerbocker Trust. Some of them, the sophisticated ones who kept their ears close to the ground, began quietly withdrawing funds. There were no lines yet. No newspaper headlines about runs, just a steady, silent bleeding of deposits as nervous customers moved their money to institutions that seemed safer. The Knickerbocker's position was precarious, but not hopeless. The bank held substantial assets. Its loans were backed by real estate, subway construction bonds, and other investments that had genuine long-term value. The problem was that those assets could not be converted to cash overnight. If depositors demanded their money faster than the bank could liquidate investments, the vault would empty regardless of what the balance sheet said. Over the weekend, Barney worked the telephones. He called his contacts at other institutions, looking for short-term loans to shore up reserves. He believed that if he could just get through the next few days, the panic would subside and normal business would resume. The Knickerbocker had assets. The loans were good. This was a liquidity problem, not an insolvency problem. He was asking the wrong people. J.P. Morgan had returned to New York from a church convention in Richmond, Virginia. He was 70 years old, suffering from a cold, and in no mood to rescue institutions he considered part of the problem. The trust companies had been operating recklessly for years, in his view. They had enjoyed the profits of thin reserves during the boom. Now they could face the consequences during the bust. Morgan was not hostile to the idea of intervention. He understood that a systemic panic could destroy sound institutions along with rotten ones. But he was not going to waste resources saving banks that he considered incorrigible. The Knickerbocker would have to prove it deserved to be saved. Then came Monday, October 21st. That morning, the board of directors of the Knickerbocker Trust met in emergency session. They looked at the weekend's withdrawals. They looked at the newspaper headlines connecting their institution to the Heinz debacle. And they looked at Charles Barney, the man whose social connections had brought this crisis to their door. They demanded his resignation. Barney was stunned. He had built the Knickerbocker from an $11 million institution to a $60 million institution. He had constructed the Marble Temple. He had made them all rich. Now they were throwing him overboard to appease a mob that might not even show up. He argued. He pleaded. He pointed out that the bank was fundamentally sound, that the assets exceeded the liabilities, that this was a panic over nothing. The board was unmoved. They needed a sacrificial lamb. Barney was it. He signed the papers and walked out of the building he had created. The board believed that sacrificing Barney would calm the markets. They announced that a new conservative leadership was taking over. They proclaimed that the Knickerbocker was sound and that depositors had nothing to fear. It was a catastrophic misreading of human psychology. To the public, the resignation was not a reassurance. It was a confession. Banks do not fire their founders unless something is terribly wrong. The news hit the ticker tape, and whatever confidence remained in the Knickerbocker evaporated. That afternoon, the National Bank of Commerce delivered the killing blow. The National Bank of Commerce was not just any competitor. It was the institution that served as clearing agent for the Knickerbocker, the bank that accepted Knickerbocker checks and converted them to cash. Without a clearing agent, a trust company was cut off from the financial system, unable to conduct the basic transactions. The National Bank of Commerce announced publicly that it would no longer clear checks for the Knickerbocker Trust Company. The meaning was unmistakable. The establishment had declared the Knickerbocker radioactive. Its money was no longer good. Barney, desperate, requested a meeting with J.P. Morgan to beg for assistance. Morgan sent a young banker named Benjamin Strong to examine the Knickerbocker's books. Strong was an interesting choice for this assignment. He was only 34 years old, a vice president at Bankers Trust, one of the institutions in Morgan's orbit. He was smart, methodical, and completely trusted by Morgan. He would later become the first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, one of the most powerful positions in American finance. But on that October evening, he was simply a trusted lieutenant with sharp eyes and a mandate to determine whether the Knickerbocker was worth saving. Strong and his team of accountants descended on the Knickerbocker's offices as depositors were still filing out of the building. They spread the ledgers across tables and began the grim work of valuation. What were the assets actually worth? Could they be sold quickly enough to meet depositor demands? Was there a hole in the balance sheet that could not be filled? The work continued through the night. Strong was known for his thoroughness. He did not take numbers at face value. He questioned assumptions. He probed for hidden problems. What he found was ambiguous. The Knickerbocker had assets, real estate holdings in Manhattan, construction loans for projects that were actually being built, investments in operating businesses that generated genuine revenue. These were not fictional entries created to fool examiners. They were legitimate holdings with legitimate value. But those assets were illiquid. They were tied up in long-term projects that could not be converted to cash overnight. A building under construction cannot be sold at a fair price on Tuesday morning. A loan that matures in 5 years cannot be called in without destroying the borrower and recovering only pennies on the dollar. The question Strong had to answer was not whether the Knickerbocker had assets. It was whether those assets could be converted to cash fast enough to stop the run. And that question depended on assumptions about how long the panic would last, how many depositors would demand their money, and whether confidence could be restored. Strong reported back to Morgan in the early hours of the morning. His conclusion was frustratingly uncertain. He could not say definitively whether the Knickerbocker was solvent or insolvent. It depended on how you valued the assets. It depended on how the panic played out. The numbers supported multiple interpretations. Morgan made his decision. The Knickerbocker would receive no help. On Tuesday, October 22, 1907, a police officer walking his beat on Fifth Avenue noticed something unusual in the pre-dawn darkness. A line had formed outside the Knickerbocker Trust Company. It was hours before the bank was scheduled to open, but dozens of people were already waiting, clutching passbooks and shuffling their feet against the autumn chill. By sunrise, the line stretched around the block. By the time the doors opened at 10 in the morning, thousands of people had gathered outside the marble temple that Stanford White had designed to project permanence and stability. The scene that unfolded over the next 2.5 hours would become one of the defining images of the Panic of 1907. The crowd was a cross-section of New York society, and in that diversity, you can see why bank runs are so terrifying. There were society matrons in furs, women who kept accounts at Knickerbocker because it was fashionable and prestigious. They stood alongside immigrant shopkeepers in work clothes, men who had saved for years to accumulate a few $100s. Messenger boys had been dispatched by brokerage houses to withdraw corporate accounts worth tens of thousands. Small businessmen who kept their operating cash at Knickerbocker pushed against elderly widows who had entrusted their entire life savings to the institution. All of them wanted the same thing: cash, now. And there was only so much cash in the vault. A bank run is a collective action problem. If everyone stays calm, the bank survives and everyone gets their money eventually. But if everyone panics, the bank fails and some people get nothing. The rational individual response to uncertainty is to withdraw your money as fast as possible. And when everyone acts rationally as individuals, the collective result is catastrophe. Inside the marble banking hall, the tellers stood at their stations and began paying out money with mechanical precision. They did not flinch. They did not argue. They did not try to convince anyone to leave their deposits. They simply counted bills, handed over gold certificates, and called the next depositor forward. The professionalism was admirable, even heroic. These were men who knew they were emptying the vault that paid their own salaries. Every dollar they handed across the counter brought them closer to unemployment, but they did their jobs. They represented the institution with dignity, even as it collapsed around them. The New York Times reporter on the scene described the atmosphere in vivid detail. As fast as one depositor left the building, 10 more pushed in, demanding their money. The line did not shrink. It grew. Police were called to maintain order. Officers formed cordons to prevent the crowd from crushing against the windows or trampling those at the front of the line. Inside the banking hall, the pile of cash and coin diminished with terrifying speed. In the first hour, millions of dollars walked out. Runners were sent out the back entrance, sprinting to other institutions, begging for emergency loans to keep the windows open. They returned empty-handed. No one wanted to throw good money into a burning building. 2 van loads of cash arrived mid-morning and were carried through a side entrance. The crowd saw the delivery and somehow found it more alarming than reassuring. If the bank needed emergency shipments of currency, how close was it to collapse? At some point during the morning, directors of the Knickerbocker forced their way through the crowd and stood on the steps, shouting assurances that everyone would be paid. It made no difference. The panic had taken on a life of its own. Reason could not penetrate fear. Shortly after noon, a man in a gray suit walked to the front entrance. The crowd fell silent. He did not speak. He simply locked the heavy bronze doors and placed a small handwritten sign in the window. Suspended. A groan went through the crowd, described by witnesses as a sound of physical pain. People who had been waiting for hours realized they would not see their money today. Perhaps not ever. Some wept. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. In exactly 2.5 hours, the Knickerbocker Trust Company had paid out approximately $8 million. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $270 million in today's money. It was an astonishing hemorrhage, a testament to how much cash the bank actually held. But against a full-scale panic, it was not enough. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, the marble temple of the new economy, was dead, or so everyone believed. While the crowds dispersed from Fifth Avenue, wandering down the street like refugees from a disaster, the fate of the American financial system was being decided in a room on East 36th Street. J.P. Morgan's private library was legendary. It was less a repository of books than a monument to one man's wealth and taste. Renaissance tapestries hung on the walls, rare manuscripts sat in glass cases, a fireplace large enough to stand and dominated one wall. On ordinary evenings, Morgan used the space to examine art acquisitions and entertain select guests. On the evening of October 22, 1907, it became the Emergency Command Center for American Capitalism. Morgan summoned the presidents of the major trust companies and banks to his home. These men arrived in a state of barely controlled panic. They had watched the Knickerbocker fall. They knew their own institutions could be next. The Trust Company of America and the Lincoln Trust were already experiencing heavy withdrawals. If confidence continued to collapse, the entire trust company sector might go under, dragging the national banks down with it. Think about what was happening here. The United States had no central bank. There was no Federal Reserve to inject liquidity into the system, no government agency with the authority and resources to stop a panic. The only mechanism was the New York Clearing House, and it had already declared that it would not rescue institutions outside its membership. The trust companies were on their own, except they were not on their own. They had J.P. Morgan. The scene in the library was almost medieval. Morgan held no government office. He was a private citizen, 70 years old and suffering from a cold. Yet in that room, surrounded by men who controlled billions of dollars in assets, he was the only authority that mattered. He organized the crisis response with brutal efficiency. Teams of accountants were dispatched to examine the books of the threatened institutions. Reports came back throughout the night. Morgan sat in his study, smoking cigars and playing solitaire, waiting for the numbers. This detail, the solitaire, appears in multiple contemporary accounts. Morgan had a reputation for appearing calm in crisis. While the bankers around him sweated and argued, he played cards, waiting for the information he needed to make decisions. When the audit of the Trust Company of America came back, the accountants reported that, despite heavy withdrawals, the underlying assets were sound. The bank was illiquid, but not insolvent. Morgan placed a card on the table and made his decision. This is the place to stop the trouble, then. He turned to the assembled trust company presidents and informed them that they would pool their resources to save the Trust Company of America. He did not ask for their agreement. He told them what was going to happen. When some hesitated, Morgan produced a document committing them to the rescue and instructed them to sign. They signed. In the early hours of the morning, $25 million was pledged to shore up the institution. The Trust Company of America would survive. But for the Knickerbocker, Morgan offered nothing. The audit of the Knickerbocker had revealed assets that were valuable but frozen in long-term investments that could not be liquidated quickly. In Morgan's judgment, the institution was too far gone to rescue efficiently. Saving it would require capital that might be needed elsewhere as the panic spread. Better to let it fail and concentrate resources on institutions that could be salvaged. There is a harder interpretation of Morgan's decision, and I should be honest about the debate among historians. Some argue that Morgan genuinely believed the Knickerbocker was beyond saving, that the numbers simply did not add up. Others suggest that Morgan saw an opportunity to discipline the trust company sector, to let a prominent failure serve as a warning to others who had been operating with reckless leverage. Perhaps both motivations were true simultaneously. Morgan was a complicated man who could hold multiple calculations in his head. He could believe that the Knickerbocker was unsalvageable and also appreciate the useful lesson its failure would provide to surviving trust companies. Whatever his reasoning, the effect was clear. The Knickerbocker was sacrificed. The Trust Company of America was saved. The message to the financial world was unmistakable. In the days that followed, Morgan continued to orchestrate rescues. He saved the Lincoln Trust. He arranged for the U.S. Steel Corporation to acquire a failing competitor, Tennessee Coal and Iron, in a deal that skirted antitrust law but prevented a broader collapse. He convinced John D. Rockefeller to deposit $10 million in the weakest banks as a demonstration of confidence. He pressured Treasury Secretary George Cortelyou to inject government funds into the system. Morgan worked for weeks, often through the night. At one legendary session, he physically locked bankers in his library to prevent them from leaving until they signed agreements committing to rescue pools. The door remained locked until 4:45 in the morning when the last holdouts finally surrendered. He saved the American financial system through a combination of brilliance, ruthlessness, and sheer force of personality. And when the crisis finally subsided in early November, the world looked at what had happened and asked an uncomfortable question. What happens when J.P. Morgan dies? The country had been saved by the judgment and resources of a single private citizen. That was terrifying. Morgan would not live forever. Who would play God the next time? Three weeks after the doors of the Knickerbocker Trust closed, Charles Barney stood in his bedroom and ended his life. He had spent those 3 weeks in isolation, cut off from the world he had inhabited for decades. The phone calls that used to fill his days had stopped. The invitations had dried up. The men who had sat on his boards and attended his dinners avoided him as if financial failure were contagious. Barney requested another meeting with Morgan, hoping that perhaps now, with the worst of the crisis past, the great man might reconsider. Morgan refused to see him. The door that the Whitney connection had opened so many years ago was locked shut. On the morning of November 14th, Barney shot himself in the chest. He lingered for several hours before dying that afternoon. The newspapers reported the death with varying degrees of sympathy. Some portrayed him as a victim of circumstances. Others saw poetic justice in the fall of a man who had flown too close to the sun. The funeral was held at the Church of the Incarnation, the pews filled with society figures who had dined at his table for decades. The Vanderbilts sent representatives. The Whitneys mourned their kinsman. But the titans who had actually decided his fate, the Morgans and the Bakers and the Stillmans, were conspicuously absent. They had moved on. The problem of Charles Barney had been solved. The cruelest detail emerged in the months that followed as receivers began to untangle the Knickerbockers' affairs. The bank was not broke. When the assets were finally liquidated, when the real estate was sold and the loans called in, the Knickerbocker Trust Company had enough money to pay back every single depositor. Not partially, not at a discount. Every depositor received 100 cents on the dollar, plus interest. There was even money left over for shareholders. Charles Barney had killed himself over a liquidity crisis, not an insolvency. His bank had been destroyed by perception, by the contagion of fear, by the decision of the establishment to cut him loose. If Morgan had provided a guarantee, if the National Bank of Commerce had continued clearing checks, if the panic had been stopped a few hours earlier, the Knickerbocker might have survived. We will never know what would have happened. History does not offer do-overs. But while Barney's fate was tragic, the fates of the men who actually started the fire offer a different kind of lesson about justice in the Gilded Age. Augustus Heinze, the copper king who had beaten the Rockefellers in Montana and thought he could beat Wall Street, was utterly destroyed. He spent his remaining years drowning in lawsuits related to the failed corner. Prosecutors pursued him for bank fraud, though they could never make the charges stick. His health collapsed along with his fortune. He turned to alcohol and drank himself into an early grave. In November of 1914, Augustus Heinze died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was 44 years old. The establishment he had challenged had ground him into dust. The brash young man who had arrived in New York with $10 million and unlimited confidence died, broke, sick, and forgotten. But his partner Charles Morse proved that some villains are too slippery to catch. Morse was indicted for bank fraud and sentenced to 15 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. For most men, this would have been the end of the story. The Ice King would rot in prison while his former associates moved on without him. Morse was not most men. Inside prison, he began secretly drinking a mixture of soap suds and other chemicals that induced violent illness mimicking the symptoms of kidney failure. Prison doctors examined him repeatedly and concluded he was dying. They petitioned President William Howard Taft, claiming that Morse had only weeks to live and should be released on humanitarian grounds to die at home, surrounded by family. Taft, who had no particular sympathy for Morse but saw no reason to deny a dying man's last wish, granted the pardon. The moment Morse was released, a miracle occurred. He traveled to Europe, stopped drinking the soap, and made a full recovery. The dying man who could barely walk out of prison was soon strolling the boulevards of Paris in apparent perfect health. He returned to business and was eventually indicted again, this time for war profiteering during the First World War. The charges involved fraudulent shipbuilding contracts with the government. Morse managed to avoid conviction again, slipping through legal loopholes and exploiting technicalities. He lived to the age of 77, dying in 1933, proving that in the Gilded Age, if you were clever enough and shameless enough, you could cheat death itself. The contrast between Heinze and Morse offers its own dark lesson. Heinze was the true believer, the man who thought he was fighting a righteous war against monopolists and thieves. He drank himself to death, destroyed by the failure of a cause he believed in. Morse was the pure opportunist, a man with no convictions beyond his own enrichment. He survived, slithered away, and lived to scheme another day. There is probably a moral in there somewhere, but I am not sure it is a comforting one. The panic of 1907 left scars that lasted for years. The economy contracted sharply in the months that followed. Industrial production fell by more than 16%. Unemployment rose. Businesses that had been thriving found themselves unable to get credit. The recession that followed was one of the worst the country had experienced since the Civil War. For the depositors of the Knickerbocker, the months of waiting were agonizing. Their money was locked up while receivers untangled the bank's affairs. Some needed that money desperately. Small businessmen who kept their operating funds at Knickerbocker could not meet payroll. Families who depended on savings. For emergencies had to scrape by on charity. The human cost of the panic extended far beyond the men who caused it. But eventually, the receivers finished their work. The real estate was sold. The loans were called in. The accountants tallied the final numbers. And to the astonishment of nearly everyone who had followed the story, the Knickerbocker paid back every depositor in full with interest. The bank had been solvent all along. The panic had been, in the end, a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom. Fear had destroyed a healthy institution. Perception had triumphed over reality. The political aftermath of the panic of 1907 was more constructive than the personal fates of its villains. The spectacle of the American economy being saved by a single private citizen terrified the government. Congress held hearings. Newspapers editorialized. The question that everyone asked was simple. What happens next time? Morgan was 70 years old in 1907. He would die in 1913. Who would coordinate the rescue when the next panic came? Who would have the resources and the authority to lock bankers in a library until they agreed to save the system? In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which created the National Monetary Commission to study banking reform. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island led the investigation, traveling to Europe to examine how other nations managed their financial systems. Britain had the Bank of England, France had the Banque de France, Germany had the Reichsbank. Every major economic power had a central bank that could serve as lender of last resort. America had J.P. Morgan playing solitaire. In 1910, Aldrich gathered a small group of bankers and policymakers at a private retreat on Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. The meeting was kept secret to avoid public outcry about bankers designing the banking system. Over the course of 10 days, the participants drafted a proposal for an American central bank. The proposal went through years of debate and revision. Politicians argued about how much control the government should have versus private bankers. Progressives worried about creating a tool for Wall Street. Conservatives worried about government interference in markets. The final legislation was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. On December 23, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The Federal Reserve was designed to do what Morgan had done in his library, but automatically and permanently. It would serve as a lender of last resort, providing liquidity to solvent banks during panics. It would manage the money supply, preventing the sharp contractions that had made the 1907 crisis so severe. It would create a system where the fate of the American economy never again rested on the shoulders of a single private citizen playing cards while bankers begged for salvation. The creation of the Fed was not a simple process. It took years of political maneuvering, compromise between competing interests, and heated debate about the proper role of government in financial markets. Republicans and Democrats disagreed about the structure. Wall Street bankers and rural populists had different visions of what a central bank should do. The final legislation was imperfect, a compromise that left many participants unsatisfied. But the core insight was sound. A modern economy cannot function without a mechanism to provide emergency liquidity during panics. Markets are prone to self-fulfilling prophecies of doom. A run on a solvent bank can destroy it just as surely as genuine insolvency. Someone needs to be able to step in and break the cycle of fear. Morgan had played that role in 1907 through force of personality and the depth of his personal fortune. The Federal Reserve would institutionalize the function, making it a permanent feature of the American financial system rather than a one-time rescue by a private citizen. The irony is that Morgan himself did not live to see the Federal Reserve begin operations. He died on March 31, 1913, just 9 months before the new central bank officially opened for business. The Pujo Committee, a congressional investigation that had grilled Morgan about his power over the financial system, had concluded its hearings just weeks before his death. Some observers believed the stress of defending himself against charges of running a money trust contributed to his decline. The committee had documented what everyone already suspected. Morgan and his partners sat on the boards of 112 corporations, with a combined market capitalization of $22.5 billion. The concentration of financial power in the hands of a few men was staggering. The Panic of 1907 had demonstrated both the benefits and the dangers of that concentration. Morgan had saved the system, but he had also dictated terms to it. The Knickerbocker Trust Company itself staggered on for a few more years as a shadow of its former self. It reopened after the panic under new management and slowly rebuilt its deposit base. Charles H. Keep, a former assistant secretary of the Treasury, took over as president and provided the conservative leadership the institution desperately needed. In 1912, the Knickerbockers' assets were acquired by the Columbia Trust Company, whose principal shareholders included the legendary miser Hetty Green. The merged institution was eventually absorbed by Irving Trust, which was itself acquired by the Bank of New York in 1989. The Marble Temple at 5th Avenue and 34th Street still stands, though you would never recognize it. In 1921, 10 stories of offices were added on top, just as Stanford White had planned when he designed the building 2 decades earlier. Then, in 1958, the entire facade was stripped away and replaced with a bland modernist exterior. The Corinthian columns are gone. The Roman grandeur is gone. A CVS pharmacy and a Bank of America branch occupy the ground floor. Thousands of people walk past every day, and almost none of them know what happened there. But the lesson remains, carved into the history of American finance like an epitaph on a gravestone. In the world of money, being right is not enough. Being rich is not enough. You can build the soundest institution in the city, and if confidence evaporates, if the establishment turns against you, if perception replaces reality, you can still be destroyed in an afternoon. Charles Barney built a temple to permanence, and it crumbled in 2.5 hours. He bet that his connections and his assets would protect him, and he learned that in a panic, protection comes only from those willing to provide it. Morgan was not willing. The club that Barney had spent his life trying to join locked the door when he needed it most. The Federal Reserve exists today because of that failure. Every time you see a news report about the Fed adjusting interest rates or providing emergency lending to a struggling bank, you are watching the institutional response to what happened at 34th and 5th Avenue in October of 1907. The ghost of Charles Barney is still with us, and the question he could not answer, the question of what happens when confidence dies, remains as urgent today as it was more than a century ago. We saw it again in 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed and the financial system teetered on the brink. We saw institutions that seemed solid one day become worthless the next. We saw the same contagion of fear spreading from one institution to another. We saw the Federal Reserve doing exactly what it was designed to do, serving as lender of last resort in a crisis that echoed the panic of 1907 in structure, if not in detail. The names change, the instruments become more complex, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably similar. Confidence is fragile, fear spreads faster than information, and when enough people decide to run for the exits at the same time, no amount of underlying value can prevent catastrophe. Charles Barney learned this lesson the hard way. He built a real institution with real assets and real value, and he watched it destroyed in an afternoon because the establishment decided he was not worth saving, because perception overwhelmed reality, because the club he had spent his life trying to join turned its back when he needed it most. The Marble Temple is gone. The man who built it is long dead. But the lesson endures, written into the structure of our financial system and the history of our economic crises. If you found this story valuable, consider subscribing. We have more tales of financial disaster, hubris, and ruin to tell. Thanks for watching.